Hi, everybody. It's Tuesday, which means it's time for our weekly Q&A with the Family Support Department at the St. Louis Arc. I'm Sharon Spurlock, and I'm really excited to celebrate social work today. Guess what? It is World Social Work Day, and we have some of the amazing social workers that are a part of our organization with me today to share their journey and talk a little bit about social work. So we're really glad you're here with us today. Thank you for coming. I'm going to start off by having our team introduce themselves. And if you guys could talk a little bit about where you went to school and then also your social work journey and how you landed here and the role you're at currently at the ARC. So I'll start with my boss, Stephanie Scott.
Thanks, Sharon. I'm Stephanie Scott. I am the Vice President of Support Services and Strategy at the ARC. I've been here close to 14 years. My path in terms of education, I got my undergrad at Truman State in psychology and quickly learned as I was in my last year there that I needed a plan of what to do because psych was not going to land me necessarily a job. So I started looking at graduate programs and also did one of those tests that you could do in the Career Center of like, what might you be good at? And social work was one of the things that popped up on there. And I thought for sure, no, that's not me. Like I'm gonna go a different route. But social work kept popping up in my life in weird ways. And so I am from St. Louis. I wanted to come back here in some capacity, and I wound up at UMSL in their MSW program, which I loved. And uh, I, when I was looking at practicums back then, there was a file cabinet full of files of all the practicum sites that you could sit in this room and go through. So sat myself down on the floor. I started going through, and I was looking specifically for an organization that worked with folks with disabilities. I knew based on some prior experience I had that that's the direction I wanted to go. And St. Louis Arc was one of those places. So I wound up doing my foundation practicum at the ARC, and I thought for sure I was going to wind up in more of a clinical career, maybe hospital social work. I did some other practicum experiences and just really loved the philosophy and the way that the ARC approached their work, and called Mark Healy, who was my field instructor at the time, say like, is there any paid work at the ARC? Can I come back? Uh, I was even willing to take an administrative job where I was just doing paperwork if it got me back to the ARC. So about the time I was going to interview, there wound up being a role in the quality department, which was the only quality role at the time, about to open up. And Sharon asked, would you like to interview for this as well? So I said, sure. I thought I was certain that that was not a route that would really fit me, but uh, I went through interviewing for a couple things, and Sharon really wanted to push me in the quality direction, which I really took a leap of faith. Uh, Luckily, I got to know Sharon really well during my practicum, and her and Mark felt like I had some skills that would go in that direction. And of course, social work does prepare you for some things in the role of quality enhancement. So while at the ARC, the bulk of my career has been working with quality in some form or fashion. Um, about 5 or 6 years ago, my role shifted to I was a director, and what I oversaw included quality training, some of our other more consultative programs like our behavior supports at the time, nutrition supports. And then over time, some other programs got added under me. And right around the time that COVID hit, it's a milestone timeline. Right around that time, I became vice president. And my current grouping of things includes, again, quality and training, family support, children's services, leisure support, transition, community living. And I think I hit all of them. So I've been in this role little close to 4 years, and it's been really interesting to see how I can use my social work skill set in a variety of ways for the organization. So it's been a really fun journey.
That was very good and very detailed. And I'm glad you pointed out that our CEO and president, Mark Keeley, is also a social worker. So this is one of a group of a few of the many social workers that could have joined us today. And I'm really happy they're here. Kelsey, why don't we continue on with the quality conversation and hear about your journey?
Yeah, thank you. My name is Kelsey Canoplo, and I am the Quality Enhancement Coordinator at the ARC. So my background was actually philosophy, which interestingly enough kind of put the seed of social work in my brain. We talked a lot about social justice through that program. So shortly after I graduated, I joined the AmeriCorps Vista program, which is Volunteers in Service to America. And that was kind of my first step into the nonprofit world. In my mind, it was also, let's give this a try before I jump into grad school. And so as I was a Vista, then I applied for grad school and got my MSW. I had a slightly less clinical focus. The first couple weeks, I thought I was going to go into mental health, and then I learned about program evaluation and spreadsheets and got super excited about that. So my track in social work was actually focused on more like the administrative side of things, which is actually how I learned about the St. Louis ARC. Because they offered a really unique practicum experience called the CEO Fellowship, where you get to work alongside the president and CEO, who's Mark Keeley, to kind of see how everything works behind the scenes. And so that was a super exciting opportunity for me. And what's at the end of it, I begged for a job at the ARC. And like Stephanie, something had just opened up in the quality and training department. And so now I've been in my role for about 2 years and do program evaluation, some of the training administration, and then also work on just our general quality plan.
You can see the method to our madness. We bring these fantastic people in and then we hold on to them. Although that is not always the case. Domenica, I do not believe you started as a practicum student here.
I did not know. I did my practicum at my first practicum at a different nonprofit, and then my year-long practicum at a hospital. So I did not start off here. My educational background. So I went to Mizzou and I got my degrees in psychology and sociology. And much like Stephanie said, social work was not even on my radar, but in one of our sociology courses my senior year, the School of Social Work director came in and presented social work and gave me a broader understanding. So I applied for grad school at a variety of places. And then we went home for spring break, which ended up being COVID. And so I'm glad that I chose a St. Louis based university instead of going back down to Columbia. So I got my master's at SLU, which the entire first year was virtual. So that was very interesting. Then I graduated in 2022 and I realized that I was not cut out for hospital social work. So the ARC actually was not my first choice. I first applied to the Down Syndrome Association of St. Louis, which I have a brother with Down syndrome. So I've always been very passionate and wanting to be in this field. And then apparently everyone else who has a family member with Down syndrome is very passionate and they were full. So then I started looking and I saw St. Louis ARC and I started reading about the organization. I was like, wow, I've never really seen another organization that supports people throughout the entire lifespan. And I thought that was very, very interesting. And so I applied for a job in children's services and I got a call that afternoon after my interview that they were excited to extend a position. And I have been here, it'll be 2 years in May, which
And tell us what you do.
I work in a subsection of children's services. It's called the Capable Kids and Families Program. I'm getting deja vu because I just did a video of this for funders, but the Capable Kids and Families Program is a monthly home visitation program where a family resource specialist such as myself brings developmentally appropriate toys and equipment to children so that they can continue to work on their developmental goals outside of therapy. So it's not a replacement to therapy, it's a supplement. Most therapies are only approved for like every other week or once a week, sometimes twice a week, but I've never heard of it daily therapy. So it's nice to be able to provide children with things that they can continue to work on. And we also get parents connected with resources. So, for example, I have a family and it's a very rare genetic disorder. So I directed parents to the National Organization for Rare Diseases and some of the other national and local organizations that support families with children with genetic and rare conditions. And the last piece is educational advocacy. So we help parents advocate for their child and setting up that child to be as successful as possible in the education setting. But we are not education lawyers. We are not special school district representatives. We are simply there to provide parents with the tools and supports necessary so that they feel confident in making sure that their child has the best educational outcomes.
Fabulous. I'm going to ask you one more thing. Am I correct that you are still needing supervision hours towards your licensure?
I am rounding out my 3,000 and I have about 200 left.
And did you do that under our supervision?
Yes, Mark Keeley, our
That Mark
president and
Keeley,
CEO.
he
He's a
is
busy
getting the
man.
bills paid, isn't he? I love that. All right,
Truly is.
fabulous. Thank you, Domenica. Libby, you're next on the screen.
So I'm Libby Everskird. I'm the Director of Transition Services here at the ARC. And I started my social work journey a little over way more than 30 years ago. So I found my way to the field during my senior service project here in St. Louis. I was taking a class as a senior in high school on social justice, and my service project exposed me to some things in our community that I was like, wow, I had no idea I lived in such a bubble, and decided I just wanted to change the world. So I went to St. Louis University for my undergrad, and I graduated with my bachelor's in social work in 1994. Started working at Children's Division in the field of foster care, where I spent 25 years of my career in various capacities in that field. Getting my master's in social work was a long time goal, but raising children interfered with that. And so it took me a bit to get there. But in 2016, I applied at UMSL, University of Missouri, St. Louis. And because I had waited so long, I had to do 2 practicums, even though I had been in the field a long time. And so while searching for my second practicum, a friend of mine who knows Mark Keeley directed me to Mark, and I was fortunate to start to do my practicum at St. Louis ARC. I had a different job at the time, so I finished and graduated in 2020, and found myself a few years later looking for a new job, and there just happened to be a position open at the ARC, and here I am. Super excited to be here.
Well, we're delighted that you're back. You know, one way or another, we get those social workers to come back and work with us. Which brings me to Leanna. She had an interesting path getting here.
Yeah, I'm Leanna. I'm the therapist at the St. Louis ARC. I did my undergrad at William Woods University, and I got my bachelor's in social work there. My practicum was with a residential facility for people who were court ordered to stay there. So juveniles were staying there, and half the girls probably had some type of developmental delay. And I realized I really wanted to work with people who voluntarily wanted services. That felt like a very big deal to me. So after undergrad, I took a year off from school and started working at Giant Step School for Autism, where I started my master's online while I was there and worked as their social skills instructor there, and realized there's a huge emotional deficit for children who really need help with that impulse control and also just regulating and understanding emotions. So during my time there, I ended up applying for practicums and found the St. Louis ARC and loved it there. I remember interviewing with Stephanie Scott and thinking, oh my gosh, I want to work at this place. This is amazing. So I did my practicum with family supports with Ann Mangelsdorf, Sharon, and then Barbara Stewart, who is recently retired. But she taught me counseling, and then I got to do a ton of family support and finding families resources and help with respite. After my practicum was done, like most of the practicum students here, I was ready to stand at the front of the building and hand up my resume to any director or other staff that walked by. Thankfully, I was able to get a job with Capable Kids and Families, which Dominica explained so well. I was a family resource specialist there and then assistant coordinator, and then moved into a family navigator position for children. And then recently moved into a therapy role where I'm currently now.
Thank you so much. I just love listening to the breadth of roles that you all have here. And I think in some ways that confuses people about social work. What in the heck is social work? I am going to confess, I do not have a social work degree, although I wish I did. I didn't have the benefit of an aha moment in high school or college where I was given the opportunity to understand what social work was. And I think for you guys, I'm going to start asking a couple questions, and maybe you can use your raise hand or just raise your hand and we'll take turns kind of going around. But there's so many. What is it that actually makes up social work? When you think about your job here at the ARC today, what was it educationally that now guides you that you're using from your social work background?
A central component of social work is our code of ethics, and it really guides how we approach engaging with individuals, engaging with a family unit, engaging with a community. For me, some of the main things that have driven how I approach my work and why I felt like I wanted to work at the ARC was this idea of self-determination and really looking at people generally from a strengths-based approach, that everyone has strengths and we move things along further if we focus on the strengths and not deficits, and that people are in charge of their own lives and are going to make decisions that maybe I don't always agree with, but we all have self-determination or should have self-determination. And I think for folks with disabilities, quite often that is in jeopardy due to various systems in place and societal norms and things like that. So for me, that was something that really central to social work that has driven my career and I think is important. Leanna, I'm gonna toss it to you then.
That's so funny, Stephanie. I feel like that's essentially my answer is the same. The code of ethics really is a driving factor and supporting the best way we can. It really provides an empowering piece for people, and our involvement of how, I guess, intimate a relationship can be, which it really shouldn't be. We're there to empower somebody and give them the tools to help them. So I really think the driving factor would be code of ethics. I think it gives a really good framework for giving people that autonomy and empowerment to make decisions for themselves, and also seeing the strengths in everyone.
Domenica?
Okay. As soon as Stephanie was finished talking, I immediately hit the raise hand button. So I could not agree more. And I specifically the piece of everybody should have a right to self-determination. And so often in the disability community, that is at jeopardy. I not only have professional experience, but I have 20 plus years of lived experience. And the infantilization of adults with disabilities has always been something that really just, I'm very passionate about changing the perspective and changing the societal norms around that. So I love so much that I get to work with these young children and families and let them know that a diagnosis or a doctor saying that a certain thing might not happen, a certain milestone might not be met, is not a definitive answer. It is not a perfect life trajectory of your child. And there are endless possibilities. People with disabilities all across the board are constantly breaking the barriers, making new records, just blowing it out of the water. And I'm so passionate about showing these young parents that, you know, are sometimes scared. They're sometimes just very worried that the possibilities are endless. I very much in back to the point of ethics, I very much do keep a professional level boundary relationship with my families, but there is something that I will never shy away from, and that is sharing that I am a sibling of an adult with a disability who was told that he would never walk, he would never talk, he would never use the restroom on his own, and now he comes into St. Louis ARC with me and does paperwork and chats everyone's ears off. And yes, so very much back to both of your points of really a strength-based focus, changing the societal views and empowering these young families, these young adults, older adults, everybody within the community that anything is possible.
Kelsey, I'm going to call you out just because your role is around more of the quantitative data. And I'm sure that the things that everybody else has talked about are important core components for you. But are there other kind of systems and practices in social work that you think really play to the work you're doing? Why are we even collecting all this data? What's the point of all of it?
A huge part of what kind of pushed me into grad school or the field of social work was um, starting out in the nonprofit industry and facing the question of what are we doing? Like, I know people are showing up every day, they're doing their jobs, but are we impacting the quality of people's lives? And that's a huge part of what drew me to the ARC actually is I started my practicum immediately after our past accreditation cycle and was so fascinated to see all the different dimensions of how we measure quality of life and how we measure the impact of the work we're doing. So that was a huge component of the social work education that then I brought to the ARC, which was already being done at the ARC as well, which ended up being a great parallel for me. But a huge part of what I learned is how to find ways to make sure that the work we're doing is having a lasting impact, and that we're helping people achieve their goals, not just getting them by. And so that was like a huge tenet of my education that has shaped what I do now. Surveys and spreadsheets don't always sound super exciting, but when you get to read all these surveys and realize that the data we're collecting is then reinforcing this message that people are achieving these goals. And so it's kind of an exciting opportunity that I get to then show that, you know, the people that we're working with are so capable and they're accomplishing so much. And it gives us kind of the data to highlight that.
Thank you. I really did. I wasn't in any way wanting to demean the data because I find it so valuable to have a team member that can come in and help us think about the why. Why are we doing this? And how do we know we're doing it? What are we measuring? And those are things that we don't often stop and take a minute to think about. So to have somebody whose focuses on that can guide us is so important. So I really appreciate that part. Libby, are you going to wrap us up on this question?
Well, I do agree with what everyone said about self-determination. I think another big component of social work is systems theory. And we talk a lot about that and how systems impact individuals and, you know, the challenges they have and the barriers. And so I've always felt my job as a social worker is to help remove those barriers, you know, so that people can live full lives and succeed at the goals that they have.
Can you give me the easy read definition of systems theory, Libby?
Oh gosh.
Well, it sounds like that outward systems are impacting the quality of people's lives.
Yes. So we're all part of systems. So I mean, we come from family systems where, you know, the St. Louis ARC is a system. You know, the people that we support in the field of disability they're impacted by systems all the time. You know, and transportation just is coming to my mind. You know, that's a huge barrier. And so how can we impact that system to have, a positive outcome for the people we support?
Great. That was an excellent answer.
Thank you.
I knew you could tell me about systems theory. While you're unmuted, Libby, I would just want to go ahead and start asking you. You guys all came through the same pathway of having practicum experiences. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about why you think it's important that the ARC have relationships with programs that bring in practicum students and interns.
As being an intern, it is important to get that real life experience. And I can speak to my practicum. I had 27 years in the field probably when I started my practicum. So in my mind, I was like, oh, what more can I learn? And also know that there's always things to learn. And the practicum experience here impacted me in such a positive way. I've never been in an organization. I would tell my mom this when I picked up my son. The people here are always trying to outdo themselves. It's like, what can we do next? How can we do this better? And it was really inspiring to see. I was fortunate that I had a lot of experiences within the ARC. So I did get to work in transition services where I work now, but also got involved in leisure. And I will say my biggest takeaway, as a social worker, we are to explore our biases and really dig in deep to those and, and really think hard about them. And, at the point I thought I'd pretty much, thought about all my biases. And I really didn't realize that I did have biases against people who are disabled or have a disability because of the way I was raised. And my mom would always say, oh, those poor people, and so I think while I knew as a social worker people could achieve and I want to empower people, I didn't really realize I had that until I started working here, or until I did my internship. So I was able to meet a lot of different people and really realize that people live very full lives, and people with disabilities live very full lives. And that was, while I knew it in my head, it was just very eye-opening and affirming to experience. So I'm grateful for that.
Thank you. I see Leanna's ready to jump in.
I feel like the practicums, kind of what Libby was saying, is you really get a full experience. During my undergrad, we got to tour places before, and we were touring a nursing home for a practicum spot. And the director there, who's a social worker, was saying how, as a social worker, you see people in the worst and most vulnerable times of their life. And you can hear that, but as a student, you can't really visualize sitting with a person during that. And a practicum is definitely a way that you can have support in that, where you have another staff member that has been a veteran in the services, where that you can watch them handle that professionally, where you can also kind of let that shock sink in as a student, and then understand how to handle that professionally later on when you are in your job, because a lot of people are sharing very personal, vulnerable things with you, and you really have to be able to handle that carefully and empathetically, but also as a professional, versus saying, wow, that's absurd. But also having a very different reaction when somebody's sharing that. So I feel like that's always something that I have in my mind, just vulnerableness. So thank you.
Excellent. Steph?
One of the beauties of social work is that it is broad. You, just like the group of us on here today, we all do very different things. And while that is wonderful, it's also daunting when you're trying to figure out what happens in your career after grad school. And I think several of us mentioned we thought we'd probably go a different track in terms of where we would land in terms of a job, but during practicum we found out that's not quite for me. So I think at the ARC we really value giving students real duties, not just here, go do paperwork or go do some admin stuff. It's really like getting into the programs as Leanna described and getting a feel for what those look like, so that you can kind of narrow in on what direction's a good fit for yourself and be prepared with those skills to then launch into a role because you have had meaningful practice when the stakes are a little bit lower, right? Like you're not necessarily employed there, and you can try things out. So I think it's just a really critical piece within social work education that sets us up for success.
Lovely. Kelsey?
Yeah, it's just a massively valuable part of your master's degree. And for me, the things that I did during my practicum were some of my biggest learning opportunities because it's where you take your coursework and begin to apply it and learn how to shift things in the real world. So even when you look at like data collection, like it shifts from the classroom to the real world, and you start getting into kind of a little bit of the messiness of figuring things out and learning from the people around you and adapting. And I will say the ARC is just such a fantastic place to do that. I mean, the projects that I did on my practicum now as a staff person, I'm building off of those. So you do get to do things that are going to have an impact in the agency. And that's a super exciting opportunity as a student because it's not the case at every site. Some don't have the capacity to have as many projects for students, but there's just such an array of services and opportunities that whether you're a counseling student or someone who likes program evaluation, people are going to find somewhere for you to get plugged in. And I will also add that as far as a practicum site, the ARC also just has a remarkable network of mentors. So there's just a huge number of people who will just meet with you and give you advice and talk through your projects or your education, and also support you as a social worker. It's heavy work sometimes. And there's people who will laugh with you or send you home to go take care of yourself and remember that you're a person first. So it's just a beautiful place to have those sorts of experiences.
I don't know if you want to add anything or not, Domenica, but Kelsey's given me the perfect lead into an audience question. So I'm going to ask that, and you can throw in anything additionally you'd want to talk to about practicum. But the question is about how do you handle self-care as a social worker? And I think this is such a real issue. There's a lot of talk right now about compassion fatigue and how to be resilient in a field where you want to be able to stay and successfully work for 20 or 30 years. It's hard work. It's messy. It's personal. So everybody's hands jumped up. Domenica, I'm going to start with you and then go to Libby.
I'm actually so glad that you answered that question before I went in, because I was going to say my take is maybe a little bit heavier, but I think it is so important to have these practicum experiences so that you know what capacity you are at. This is a field and a type of job that has capacity for high burnout. In certain situations, you need to know your boundaries. Working in a hospital setting, specifically, I spent 6 months in pediatric oncology and radiology, and that took a very big toll on me. And I recognize that this is not something that is sustainable for me. This is something that actually would push me out of the field had I continued in this type of work. Not to say that, child passing doesn't happen in different fields and different populations, but to have it as a constant of seeing that as a student, it made me realize the people that do this work are incredible. I'm not one of them. And for the sake of patients and myself, I need to be in a different type of organization. So yes, back to everybody's points, practicum is just so important for understanding what your capacity is, what your limits are, and where you would thrive best. So just know your capacities and take the time to engage in the self-care as often as possible.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, Domenica, you said boundaries, and that's so important. And, that's something I promote with the people that I supervise. When you're off, be off. When you go on vacation, take your vacation, disconnect, don't check your emails, don't check your messages, don't call people after hours. Everyone gets into this field because they care. And, there is a thing as caring too much, and, it can really impact you in a negative way. And also similar to what you said, Monica, too, I finding a healthy work environment is also important. you know, you want to have people that support you and encourage you to have those healthy boundaries. And if you're not finding that, then it's important to maybe look elsewhere and find somewhere that's more supportive. Lean on your social work friends and find a mentor. That's my advice.
Those are both all things that maybe aren't the first thing you think about when you think of self-care, but that's that macro level view of self-care being in the right place and following guidelines that make sense for you. So Kelsey, what do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll add to what Libby was saying, that in a lot of ways, self-care and boundaries are a skill that you develop over time. And it's hard to do that. And it is infinitely easier to do that when you're in a place that encourages it. And I think once you have those boundaries and you've learned those skills, then you start recognizing like, oh, this is an opportunity for me to say this. But I think when you're in, like, I had a few notable experiences at the ARC. Somebody sent me an email and was like, oh, are you working today? And I was like, oh, I'm kind of off, but I can do something. And she's like, you're not kind of off then, you're off work. Like, I'll see you Monday. And I think, you know, during my practicum, I was really burned out one afternoon. I just didn't feel good. And I was sent home, and my practicum task was to go take care of myself and go take a walk. And I think when you're in an environment that supports it, you just build those skills so much quicker. And I think there should be more and more organizations that are teaching people how to set healthy boundaries, and teaching people that taking care of themselves should be a part of their job, especially in a field where there's really heavy days. Sometimes you go home and you cry in your car because it was, you know, some really heavy stuff. And so to be aware of that and build those skills early in your career or at any point of your career is super important.
I definitely think the boundaries is a big piece. Kind of, I think Libby said earlier, the ARC is an organization where we just care so much and want to do so much. And then kind of going back of what Kelsey and actually everyone was saying, this can be a very heartbreaking job, where you do need to keep your cup full for the others that you're supporting. Where I feel like that self-care piece, it's almost like you have to schedule it. I know I have to do that, just have that routine of like that scheduled time for myself. Otherwise it won't happen. And also having boundaries of like, okay, I worked over 40 hours a week. Like last week, I'm going to take flex time. I know Sharon has sent me home when I've been burnt out and told me, I don't care what you do, just go home today and take care of yourself. And that's really helpful to have an organization that is so supportive and coworkers that are honestly so supportive. And also supervisors. I know Stephanie, during my practicum, you were my field supervisor and would check in on that. Mark supervised me for licensure and he would check in on that. So I think we're doing more, especially as our organization and also as social workers, to check in on people to do self-care and also set boundaries in place as well of like how much you can do.
Steph,
I'll just wrap up as my as you all have been talking, I've been really thinking about it through like a supervisor lens of, I think, to Kelsey's point, modeling self-care often comes from the top to set the tone. And I truly believe in that. Like, I'm not going to send you an email on the weekend or after hours. Like, if I need to get a hold of you, I'm going to call you. And delay send has become my best friend. If like, the way my brain works, if I need to like type out an email really quick so I don't lose it and it's after hours, I'm delaying send till the next morning. And I, because of our phones and we get dinged all the time, like I know that like I'm not necessarily shutting off my notifications every night, but like I personally am not going to respond to your email after 5. Like it's just setting those, again, it all comes back to boundaries and knowing your capacity. And those have definitely changed for me over time based on my life situation. When I had kids, it kind of forced some additional boundaries in place because like I gotta make pickup. I gotta like it's family time at a certain time. And I think having the flexibility that the ARC provides based on your family situation, based on like just what's going on in your life now, and having those times where, yeah, you might work more at one point, but you flex your hours and making sure to take advantage of that because I think we all really have this culture of extending each other grace and having some transparency about like, hey, if something is not going well for you, whether it's your personal life or your work life, let's talk about it. And having those spaces are really critical, both at work and at home. And Mark Keeley's favorite thing to ask is, what are you doing for you? And so being able to talk about that is really important.
Kelsey, I'm gonna have you wrap us up.
Yeah, I just actually had one more quick thought as Stephanie was talking. And I think sometimes, kind of like how she was talking, is you have to be very intentional about it. And I think sometimes it takes a moment of you just sitting back and thinking, like, what boundaries do I need to set? Like the first vacation I took, I was like, oh, I'm going to attend a meeting while I'm on vacation because it's an important meeting. And Mark sat me down and was like, why? Like, why do you want to attend this meeting? Is this a pattern that you want to set in your career, that you're available when you're on vacation? And I think having that intentional conversation was important because now when I set my out of office, it's I'm not available. It's not a if you need me, I'm available. It's I'm not available, but this person is. And I think sometimes having those really intentional moments where you think through what you want your career to look like. And it's okay to tell people I'm not available after this time. But I think it takes it's easy to creep into like, oh, my work is important. I need to do this. I need to do this. And I think sometimes it just takes a minute of stepping back and being like, this can wait until tomorrow, or this can wait until next week.
Well, what Kelsey said made me think about, it's really easy for your identity to become, I'm a social worker, I help people. And so like Kelsey just said, take a step back from that. My mentor told me at the end of the day, it's just a job. And I was taken aback by that at first. But that is true. And life will go on without me if I'm not here. So I don't know. I think having that perspective, it's an important job and it is also a job. So.
Lovely. Well, happy World Social Work Day to all of you. Thank you so much for joining me today. I still wish that I could have been a social worker, but I'm blessed to have all of you social workers in my life. I'm so proud to work with you every day.